think I got it set up, maybe.
All right. So today we're going to be looking at the concept of supply, which again is sort of kind of similar to demand, but in some ways quite different because we are looking at the entire, different side of the equation here, looking at the producer's side of things, okay? So looking at a lot of the same stuff, sort of the counterpart to what we were talking about yesterday with demand. So we're still talking about competitive markets, and when we look at this model, the supply and demand model, we talked about demand yesterday. Today we'll add supply to it, so we're going to add a new curve and make that kind of an X, like I was talking about. Okay. So some of the terminology that we just need to, basic terminology that we need to understand. So supply, just as demand shows us how much of a good people are willing to purchase, that people want, that people will demand at a certain price, supply tells us how much of a good producers are willing to supply at certain prices. Okay, that's telling us how much of a good or service that producers, those that make the good, provide the good, the sellers, how much of it they are willing to supply at certain prices. So if the price of something is $1, then producers are willing to provide 500 units, so forth and so on. That is supply. Essentially the opposite of demand. Now, quantity supply then is, of course, the same thing as quantity demanded. You're just talking about on the supply side of things. So that is the amount that producers are willing to supply at a specific price. So that's the amount that producers are willing and able to supply at a specific price. So at $5, this is the quantity supplied. At $6, this is the quantity supplied, so forth and so on. Just like with demand. So quantity supplied, you're talking about at a specific price, or supply in general, you are looking at any number of prices, okay, all together. There are multiple quantities supplied along one supply curve, okay? Now, yesterday we learned the law of demand, and the law of demand says what? Right, that as price decreases, demand increases, and vice versa. Okay, there's an inverse relationship that the price and quantity demanded go opposite ways. The law of supply, however, suggests that as price increases, supply also increases, or vice versa. So as price increases, supply also increases, and the other side of that is as price decreases, what happens to supply or quantity supplied? It decreases. Okay, so there's a positive relationship between those. In demand, it is inverse; they move in opposite directions. With supply, it moves in the same direction. Okay, so the price or the change in price and the change in quantity demanded is going to move in the same direction when it comes to supply, and that makes sense. If the price of something goes down, suppliers are going to be willing to supply less. Why? They're not going to get as much money for each of those goods or services that they sell, and they've got to then, supply less so as to offset their costs and all those sorts of things. That makes sense. So it moves in the same direction. Therefore, when we graph this and make a supply curve, so a supply curve is the graphical representation of supply. It's the graphical representation or illustration of supply, showing us, how much are the quantity demanded the quantity supplied rather, at certain prices. And it shows us this positive relationship. Therefore, because it's showing this positive relationship, what is the supply curve going to look like? It's going to be angled upwards. Okay, so as demand curves slope downward, because of the law of supply, because of that positive relationship, supply curves are always going to angle upward. So that's what we mean by we say that these competitive markets make an X. Okay, we're always going to label everything price and quantity. Demand will always be downward sloping, supply upward sloping, like that. So it makes an X. Now sometimes like this when they're really exact, it may literally curve around. But when we're doing just models, doing like this is just fine. So for example, just to make sure we know how to read this, and I know we all do. See, this is showing us once again coffee beans, okay? And at 50 cents a pound, how much is being supplied? It's about 8 billion pounds, okay? And if the price goes up to $1.25, how much is being supplied? About 11 million pounds. So we see as the price goes up, suppliers want to supply more and more of those things. Okay, makes sense. All right, so just like with the demand situation, we must understand the difference between movement and a shift. Because sometimes we'll just be moving along an existing supply curve, but supply itself does not actually change. And a lot of times, though, we actually move the whole curve, either to the left or to the right. And thankfully, this works the exact same as it does under demand, okay? So movement along the supply curve. For example, right here, all right? If we go from point A to point B, that's movement along the supply curve. The supply curve did not shift. It's still in the same place. We're just at a different place on it. If we're at point A, what is the price of coffee beans? $1 per pound, and the quantity supplied? 10 billion, okay? If we move to B, okay, now 11.2 billion are supplied. What is the price now? $1.50. So what's the only thing that, the quantity changed? Yes, but what else changed here? The price. So movement along the supply curve, that happens only in reaction to a change in price. Same thing with demand, okay? We move from one spot to the other because of a change in price. So the change in quantity supplied in reaction to a change in the price, that is movement along the supply curve. And remember, just like with demand, only a change in price does that. Okay? But we also then need to know about shifts in the supply curve. All right? So what we just looked at was movement along it because the price changed. So movement along the supply curve is just a change in quantity supplied, not supply. But if the supply curve shifts, then that's a change in supply itself. It's not just a change in the quantity supplied, but supply itself is changing. It is shifting, either to the left or the right. We'll talk about that part of it in just a second. And this is because of some other external factor, something other than price. Some other external factor, something other than price, is causing supply itself to change. Just like we saw yesterday, you had the demand schedule that showed all those different points on the graph. You also have a supply schedule. When something external changes, that whole supply schedule gets sort of redone, redrawn, and the supply curve gets redrawn. So if we notice right here, this is a second supply curve. So if we're moving from point A to point C, that's not moving along the curve. That is a whole new curve because now at the same price as the first one, at $1, 10 billion pounds of coffee were supplied. But now at $1, how many are supplied? 12 million. Okay? Price did not change in that situation. The quantity supplied did because it's a new supply curve. Something happened, some external factor caused suppliers to be willing or able to supply more at the same price that they previously were. So that is an actual shift. So remember that the only thing that causes movement along the supply curve is the price, and that's only changing quantity supply. Shifting the supply curve is some other external factor, and that is actually shifting supply itself. So just like we said yesterday, when you hear in the news and such that, the price of gasoline has gone down and so the demand has increased, that is wrong. According to economists, people use that in layman's conversation all the time, but in terms of true economics, that's technically incorrect. The same is true of supply. If we said, the price of hand sanitizer has gone up, and so supply has gone up. Again, that's technically wrong. It's quantity supply. Okay, they're supplying more because people are, wanting it. It's a response to that change in demand. So, if we're looking at our shifts in the supply curve, thankfully also, this works the same as it does in demand. The law itself is inverse from what demand is, but movements of the curve work the same. If there's an increase in supply, it's going to move to the right. So looking at the graph here on the screen, is this an increase? Yes, because it moved to the right. And again, it makes sense. And if you look at the numbers, it's pretty simple. We can see, just as we were looking at a moment ago, before at $1 they were supplying 10 million or billions of pounds of coffee beans. Now at $1 it's 12, so that's an increase in supply. It moved to the right. A decrease in supply means a leftward shift. Like I told you yesterday, less equals left. Okay, just remember, less equals left, moving towards the inside. Okay, so now let's take a look at those things that cause it to shift. Once again, what's the only thing that causes movement? Change in the price. The only thing that causes movement is a change in the price. The only thing that causes shift are these, essentially about 5 overall things that cause changes. And then all kinds of different specific examples could come out of all these different sort of overreaching things. And a lot of them, as you're going to see, are kind of similar to the demand side, but once again, you got to always think about it from the producer's side when you're looking at supply. Okay? So one thing that would shift the curve either to the left or the right, okay, that would actually create a new supply schedule. We'd have a totally different situation, is changes in the input prices. Perhaps the change that we just saw on a graph a moment ago has to do with a change in the input prices. Now, what are inputs? What do we mean by that? Right, the resources that go into making the thing, okay? That could be the machinery, that could be the raw materials, that could be the labor, all of that sort of stuff. If that stuff were to become cheaper or more expensive, that would change the supply itself, okay? If those inputs, let's say the price of those things goes down, all right? What do you think that would do to supply? Would it increase it or decrease it? It would increase it. If it's making it less expensive for the producer to produce it, they're going to supply more. What if those inputs became more scarce and therefore more expensive? They pull back on supply, okay? So changes in the input prices affect the supply curve. Perhaps the one we saw a moment ago about the coffee beans, maybe there was a drought or something, or not a drought, but maybe there was, that would have decreased it. Maybe the workers' pay went down, okay? There was a change in the wage laws or something, and they're able to pay people less or something along those lines. Maybe they got new machinery that's able to do things faster than humans could. That would increase the supply. Now, changes in the price of related goods. Now, this sounds just like what we were talking about with demand yesterday, but it's a little bit different on the supply side. So, related goods, when it comes to demand, we talked about substitutes and complements. We actually have that in supply as well, but we also are looking at it from the side of production. So let's talk about what this means. So we can have on the supply end of things what are called substitutes in production. So substitutes in production is just like what it sounds like. You know, when you could make one product with these resources, but you could also make something else using those same resources, okay? So suppliers would look at, you know, okay, I've got these resources, I can make this good, or I can make that good. So that's what we mean by substitutes in production. I could use the same factory that I used to make cars. Well, I could also use the same stuff to make airplanes. All right, those might be substitutes in production. I know it's not exactly apples to apples in that situation, but they could use those tools, they could use those workers to make something else, okay? And if the price of those substitutes in production changes, that might change the supply of, you know, the thing they were producing originally. So let's say that they were producing cars, all right, but the price of airplanes goes up significantly. What might they decide to do? They're going to use some of those resources to produce airplanes and therefore less cars. So it would decrease the supply of the cars. Okay, that's what we mean by substitutes in production. This could also be real common in like agricultural products. A farmer could grow a field of corn, or they could also use that exact same field and the exact same tools and everything and their labor, all their time, and grow soybeans or something like that. So let's say they've been growing corn, but now the price of soybeans has risen. What might they do? Stop growing corn and start growing soybeans. So what happens to the supply of corn? It falls down. Okay. So substitutes in production, when they can use the same resources to make a different product. Okay. As those things change, they might make decisions about what they're producing, thus changing the supply of one thing or another. There are also complements in production. These are things, it's like how complements, when it comes to the demand side, are things that are often used together. Complements in production are things that are often produced together. Okay, things that are often produced together, but not like peanut butter and jelly or something. Think of it more as like byproducts. You have certain things that you produce and then kind of create other byproducts along with it. So, for example, like beef and leather. Okay, if there's a lot of beef being produced, and that's creating a byproduct of the hides and skin that might then be used for leather. Okay, let's use that as one potential example. Or wheat and hay. Okay, they use part of that, to grind into flour and make bread and things like that. And part of that becomes hay that's used on farms and different things like that. So those things are oftentimes made together. So let's use the beef and leather example. Let's say that the price of beef goes up. Okay, so suppliers of beef are going to do what? They're going to want to sell more beef. Okay, so what's that going to do to the supply of leather? It's going to increase it too. Okay, so you see those things that work together, they will, if one of them increases, the other's going to increase as well. Whereas in substitutes, it's inverse. An increase in the price of one might cause a decrease in the supply of the other. Okay, so that works a little bit differently. We just have to think about it a little bit differently. Think about it from the perspective of the supplier. Okay, we can have changes in technology. This is similar to the inputs, but not quite the same. Changes in technology. And this one's pretty easy. So if there's new technology available, maybe new machinery, faster machinery, new programs, new software, something along those lines, what would that probably do to supply? It would make it faster, therefore it would increase it. Okay, increase supply. So usually changes in technology are going to mean increases in supply because they make it overall easier for the supplier. Overall, think of it this way: if it makes it easier and quicker for the supplier to produce something, that's going to increase the supply. Now, sometimes students overthink this and they go, oh, but a change in technology is expensive. That will cost a lot of money for them to outfit their factory with all this new machinery, to upgrade all their computers and all that sort of stuff. Yes, but in the end, that would be, and we'll talk about that, get real technical with that later about balancing all that kind of stuff out. So just make sure you think in this case of technology, not of the cost that it takes to implement all of that, but how, despite the cost, it is making things easier for them, and they'll be able to produce more. And the idea is, if you balance it right, you'll be able to offset the cost of, improving technology and doing stuff that may be more expensive. But if it's making you more productive, then it, theoretically would balance itself out at a point. Obviously, it wouldn't be too much or not enough. But overall, if you're making it easier for producers to produce something, you are increasing supply. And you may also see some examples where there may be a decrease in technology, okay? Maybe a big computer virus comes through and wipes out all the computer systems and stuff like that. Or there's some kind of a natural disaster that wipes out things. In that case, of course, that would decrease the supply. All right, change in the number of producers. Competition. We saw something similar when it came to demand yesterday. The more producers there are of something, what does that do to supply? It increases it, obviously. If there's more people making something, then it increases it. If there are less producers, what happens? It decreases the supply, so that would shift it. A year and a half ago, you go into the store, the drugstore, to buy hand sanitizer, and there was Germ-X, and there was Purell and a couple of those, and there's a little section in the store of hand sanitizer. Okay, now what do you see? There's all kind of brands of hand sanitizer, some of you never heard of before. Off-brand people that didn't make hand sanitizer before, and it's everywhere, right? Yeah. So we had an increase in the number of producers, and now it's all over the place, yes? And that's also in response to, people are wanting that stuff more, changing the price, all that sort of thing. And supply and demand do, of course, work together, because part of that's on, that side of it. Now, one other, and then we'll talk about another one that sometimes gets mentioned. I didn't put it up here because it's really kind of something else, but I want to clarify it. But anyway, changes in expectations. This is also the same as demand. You just have to think about it from the supplier's point of view. So we're talking about expectation of what's going to happen, to the prices of things in the future. So this could be a situation like maybe the supplier expects that, maybe we're talking about, winter coats, okay? They know that the winter's coming, so they are anticipating that people are really going to want lots of winter coats here in the future, and so that would change the supply. They might either supply more, depending on the situation, or they might hold back. You could also be talking about the changes in expectations of the inputs. So they expect, the input prices to change, those sorts of things. So they're anticipating what the market's going to do, and they may be right or wrong about it, but that could shift the supply and cause them to either produce, if they think the price of something is like cars, it's really going to go up in the next 6 months, what might they do to the supply of cars right now? Yeah, hold it back. They would hold it back and decrease it so that when the price goes up in a couple of months, then they start supplying more of them at that higher price, okay? And vice versa, if they anticipate the price of something is going to go down, they might supply more now while they can, and people are, willing to pay that higher price. Now, sometimes you will see, I've seen some people put like changes in policy as an example of a supply shifter, like government policy, like if the government put taxes or if they relieved taxes and gave subsidies, those kinds of things. That does change supply. But the reason I don't have that up here is because technically that is an input situation. Okay, so if you see one about changes in a tax situation, or the government is taxing a business more or less or something, that changes inputs. So think of that as changes in inputs. Although I have seen people list that as a change in policy or government policy as its own shifter. But again, I really think that fits under the umbrella of inputs, okay? But let's just say, for example, the government implements new taxes on manufacturers of cars. Keep using cars as an example, I guess, because there's a thing right there. What would that do to the price of the inputs? If they tax them. It increases, it's made more expensive, and they've got to pay taxes based on how much they produce, or even if it's a flat rate. If they lower taxes or give them what are called subsidies, we'll talk more about subsidies later on, what would that do? That would bring their costs down and therefore increase the supply, okay? All right, so that's just a brief introduction to how supply works, all right? And what we'll do on Monday is we'll put all this together, put supply and demand together, and so talk about what that shows us, and then what we do when all these things start shifting around and when they start shifting together and all that sort of stuff, okay? That's as far as we're going to go with that today. We're going to practice some more with demand, looking at the graphs, okay? Questions on any of that? All right, so let me hold up.